What's up everyone, I'm Eldritch and welcome back to What is Total Warhammer? The show in which I dissect all the information we have about Total Warhammer in a step-by-step fashion. In this year's second episode, I'm going to look at the minor differences that make Total Warhammer so different from the other Total War games. And the three most minor differences, of course, are magic, monsters, and mighty heroes. Magic in Warhammer Fantasy is actually quite similar to how magic is explained in the Discworld novels by Terry Pratchett. It's just a grittier and more serious version of it. Magic manifests itself in the Warhammer world in the form of the 8 winds of magic. And manipulating these 8 winds is where the wizards get their power. There are some other ways of utilizing magic, such as chaos magic, war magic, the high magics, and dark magic. But they are not specifically winds of magic, they are just different ways of getting your magic. The 8 winds of magic find their most basic interpretation and representation in the 8 colleges of the human empire. The human colleges of magic were set up with the help of the High Elf Teclis, who wanted to arm the humans with magic so that they could stand against the forces of chaos. But he was also aware that the human mind was simply incapable of mastering magic like the High Elves did. And so instead he set up the doctrine that every human wizard would have to focus on one of the winds of magic. The 8 colleges are the Light Order, which follows the wind of Hysh or the lore of light, the Gold Order, which studies the wind of Chamon or the lore of metal, the Jade Order studies the wind of Giran with the lore of life, the Celestial Order studies Azir or the lore of heavens, the Grey Order studies Ulgu, the lore of shadows, the Amethyst Order studies Shyish or the lore of death, the Bright Order studies Akshi, the lore of fire, and the Amber Brotherhood, because they have to be different, study the wind Gur with the lore of beasts. The High Elves don't restrict themselves to just one lore of magic, they study multiple lores and are even able to combine the winds into what they call the High Magic. Different High Elf mages focus on different winds, and High Elf Archmages are those who have mastered all the lores. Dark magic is interesting in that it is not part of the winds of magic. It is pure warp energy that has manifested itself in the world and is then used to devastating effect. The disadvantage of dark magic is that it is very dangerous for the user. Always a chance that the user might be pulled into the warp if they overdo the use of dark magic. Dark magic is most popular with the Dark Elves and the Skaven. The Skaven have turned dark magic into their own lores of pestilence, destruction, and stealth, whereas the Dark Elves prefer a more purified version of it. Necromancy combines Shyish, the lore of death, but also takes dark magic influences. It is a perversion of magic that is not suffered in any of the human kingdoms, but it finds common usage among the vampire counts and their minions. Chaos magic is actually a different beast entirely because it is really a divine magic. You receive these magical powers as a reward for your prolonged servitude of the three chaos gods, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Slaanesh. The 4th Chaos God, Khorne, doesn't like magic, and instead rewards his followers with a healthy roid rage. The war magic practiced by the Greenskins is also given to them by their gods Gork and Mork. So we're once again dealing with a divine gift and not something that has to do necessarily with the winds of magic. However, divine magic in the Warhammer universe is still fueled by the winds of magic. It gets a little bit complicated when you enter the territory of divine magic. And all of this really boils down to having lots and lots of different powerful effects that can impact the battlefield in Total Warhammer. Fireballs, quickly rusting or melting metal, comets, lightning strikes, buffs, debuffs, healing, raising the dead, plagues, demon summoning. The list goes on and on and on with useful effects that change the game completely. I glossed over this in the first episode, but I really felt that it was interesting to go a little bit deeper and really show how varied the magic in this universe really is, and how many options it will give players for their armies. So far we haven't heard anything definitive about how powerful magic is actually supposed to be. The first couple of videos we've seen, magic was insanely powerful, then it got toned down a bit, and most recently it has been toned up again a little bit. But no matter how powerful it actually ends up being in the final game, magic is a complete game changer for the Total War franchise. Another thing that the Warhammer universe has plenty of is monsters. Usually Total War games only feature all kinds of varieties of humans. Humans on foot, humans on horse, humans on camels, and very rarely humans on elephants. But with the game rooted in reality, we're always just shown historical armies of humans fighting other humans. Whereas in the Warhammer world, you have tons of differences. Some armies focus very heavily on ranged combat and artillery, whereas other factions have absolutely none of that, but are full of monsters and undead, and thus the factions are so much more varied than any Total War game previously. Because not only is every major faction significantly different with humans, orcs, dwarves, skaven, lizardmen, etc., but there are also a lot of monsters that go into these armies. Trolls, ogres, dragons, giants, wyverns, griffins, vargulfs, dragons, ogres, giant spiders, gargantuan spiders, and they have a major impact on how the game is played. Because now instead of having spearmen be really good against cavalry, they can also be really good against giant infantry. And where cavalry is usually good against everything that isn't spear infantry, they're also probably not so great against giant trolls. It really shakes up the usual metagame of Total War, and has the potential to turn it into something quite awesome. Now for the specific factions that we already know are going to be in the game, the Empire doesn't have that many monsters because they focus a little bit more on ranged units and artillery, and they do have tons of that stuff with mortars and rocket artillery and cannons and riflemen and crossbowmen, but they also do have some monsters such as griffins, which can be mounted by heroes, demigryphs, which are a non-flying heavy cavalry unit, the mighty steam tank, which is kind of a monster in itself, and the Empire also used to have ogres, but I'm not sure if they still do in the most recent version of the lore. Orcs, on the other hand, have tons of monsters. They have giant spiders ridden by goblins, they have huge spiders ridden by a bunch of goblins, they have trolls, they have giants, and the ferocious yet absolutely hilarious squigs. Dwarves really don't have any monsters whatsoever, and by the way, they also don't have any cavalry. But to make up for that, they have the gyrocopters, a ton of really good effective artillery, and very hardy, very difficult to kill infantry troops. The Vampire Count's army consists entirely of monsters because they are all undead. But beyond ghouls, skeletons, and zombies, they also have some bigger monsters, such as vargulfs, vampire bats, direwolves, and of course ghosts and wraiths, which are very powerful undead units in the board game, and I would assume that they're also really powerful in Total Warhammer. Chaos also has a bunch of monsters, but shares a lot of them with the orcs, in that they have trolls and giants, but they also have the mystical dragon ogres, which are kind of like a centaur creature, half ogre and half dragon. But the most common type of monster in the Chaos army is of course demons. They come in all sorts of variations depending on which god they belong to, and they've always been really powerful units in the game. And then lastly, we of course have heroes. A big part and draw of this game's narrative is the focus on legendary lords. Each faction in the game gets a couple of legendary lords who have their own tech tree that unlocks new skills and abilities for them, but can also slightly change up the abilities of their troops that they command. They're super powered independent characters on the battlefield, and they are much stronger than regular troops. A legendary lord can probably take on a unit of chaff and kill a ton of them. The agent system of previous Total War games has also been changed up slightly in that these agents are now able to fight in the battle as well. So for the Empire, for example, we already know that there's going to be warrior priests and witch hunters, which will be able to follow you into combat, buff your troops, debuff enemy troops, and just be a real nuisance for the enemy. Legendary lords also have quest lines that grant them new gear, new abilities, new mounts, useful spells, and artifacts if you successfully complete the quest. And the purpose of these is to provide your campaign with an extra strand of narrative that goes beyond the usual conquest. It gives you very specific objectives to complete and places to go. One of the legendary lords in the game is Balthazar Gelt, who is a very powerful imperial wizard of the Gold Order. Back in his day, he defeated the previous supreme patriarch of the colleges, Thyrus Gorman, taking over the role and replacing the prominence of the Bright Order with that of the Gold Order. He's a good example because he's a primary character in the Warhammer lore, and all of these legendary lords are going to be those primary characters. In Total Warhammer, he is the Empire's secondary legendary lord, next to the Emperor Karl Franz. Now that's all I have to say for now about magic, monsters, and mighty heroes, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I know there was a bit of a gap between this one and the first episode, but the third episode should follow much sooner. But until then, I've been the Cloaking Donkey, and I'll see you in another video.